The main things you say and right throughout the world. All right, you're on. Ask a question. No, thank you. What a nice room. It's a great room. It's a great room. I love the whole scroll of everyone else. Yeah. You're on. You're on. Yeah, you can mute temporarily.
That's what's called a hot mic, right?
It's a hot mic. It is. I'm just waiting for the lights to dim, the doors to close, one of those things.
You know, Sharon's here. Sharon Foley.
But there's other people from the sheriff here.
Has she come to the show yet? No?
No, we just opened it. But I will make sure I'll invite her. There's at least 2 people from the sheriff here tonight, but I'm not seeing them right away. They'll be at dinner. We have water. Oh, no, we don't have water. Oh, I was like, wait, there's extra water. Yeah. You ready? Okay, welcome everybody. Take a minute to find a place. There's some more seats. I don't know where actually. We're filling up a little bit. We can get some extra seats if we need them. So welcome. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones if you haven't done so already. Appreciate it. And just a reminder, at the end of the program, we will take questions and we ask that you wait for a microphone to come to you so that our Zoom audience can hear your question. So that's just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So, great. I'm Janine Mileaf. I am the Executive Director and Chief Curator at the Arts Club of Chicago. And tonight feels to me like an exhibition very long in the making that was destined to come to the Arts Club. As the exhibition attests, the circles that Mina Loy traveled in overlapped significantly with our own history. And it was somehow our missed opportunity not to have shown her work during her lifetime. Loy's career is one with many questions as to how it did or did not enter the annals of history and art history. But before we begin to get to know that a little bit better in our conversation tonight, I'd like to take a few minutes to thank those of you in the audience who made it possible. So we are, first of all, extremely grateful for the support of the Terra Foundation for American Art and the Zell Family Foundation. Both of these incredible institutions have helped us to bring the gravitas to this work that it really requested. And we are sincerely indebted to our colleagues at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, especially Anne Goodyear, who originated this project and dedicated years of research and preparation. To the design team World, which is Frank Modrigon and Alejandro Stein, who helped us imagine the gorgeous installation downstairs. And of course, the team at the Arts Club of Chicago, David, Adam, Mia, Jenna, Charla, the incredible staff that make everybody feel welcome. We couldn't do a show without all of you. So now my great thanks are due to the fabulous speakers I have on stage with me tonight, Jennifer R. Gross and Roger Conover, for whom this exhibition has been a passion project from the very start. Some started earlier than others. Jennifer Gross is the curator of Mina Loy, Strangeness is Inevitable. She is a scholar of modern and contemporary art whose exhibitions include Richard Archschwager, exclamation point. We have an exclamation point in our dining room. And the landmark and memorable Société Anonyme Modernism for America, which was very landmark for me personally. Previously, Jennifer was the curator of modern art and contemporary art at the Yale University Art Gallery, chief curator and deputy director of curatorial affairs at the De Cordova Sculpture Park and Museum, and the founding executive director of the Hauser and Wirth Institute, a not-for-profit institution dedicated to the support of artists' archives and scholarship. She has written extensively on contemporary art, including the work of Josiah McElhenney, Jim Nutt, Richard Rezac, Allison Schatz, Richard Tuttle, and Rachel Whiteread. Her most recent essay, A Return to Sculpture, was commissioned by the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Getty Museum for the exhibition Cy Twombly, Making Past Present. Jennifer earned her PhD in art history from the Graduate Center at CUNY in New York City. So, some of you may know Roger Conover as the longtime editor of the Art and Architecture Publishing Program at the MIT Press, a program that he established in the 1970s and guided for more than 40 years. It's not an overestimation to say that he shaped art history for the years that I was in graduate school and really put on the map most of the most important books that came out in those years. I believe that some of his authors are here tonight. During that time, he also served as guest critic for the Brooklyn Rail, editorial advisor to the Whitechapel Gallery, and the Loeb Fellow at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. In addition to his editorial work, Roger has curated exhibitions at the ZKM in Germany, the Neue Galeria in Austria, and the Hauser and Wirth Institute in New York. A specialist in the magazines and movements of the East European avant-garde, Roger is a dual citizen of the USA and Slovenia. More apropos to his appearance here tonight, he is a poet and the editor of the two critically acclaimed editions of Mina Loy's writing, The Last Lunar Baedeker, published by Jargon Press in 1982, and The Lost Lunar Baedeker, published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in 1996, both of which now serve as the standard editions of her poetry and prose. He's currently working on a screenplay, which we want to hear more about, featuring the lives and loves of Mina Loy and Arthur Craven. So, without further introductions, please join me in welcoming Jennifer and Roger to the Arts Club stage. So I want to start tonight's conversation with probably the most pressing question, which is for Roger. How you first came to this work and what about it captured you in the way that you have now spent 50 years thinking about?
Well, first of all, Janine, thank you for what you've done here. It's my first time at the Arts Club of Chicago, and I was completely transported when I walked into this space, because I was walking not only into a space, but I felt like I was walking into a time here, a time which is not this time or our time, but a time much closer to when Mina Loy made the works that are here, as they were shown at the Julian Levy Gallery and other sort of iconic modernist spaces. You've achieved something with Alejandro here, which is quite remarkable. I think the exhibition designer who's with us tonight. Yeah, to go back to the beginning for me, I guess I go back into my early 20s when I was a graduate student in English studying modern poetry. And I was particularly interested in little magazines of the 10s and 20s, magazines with names like The Dial, The Little Review, Poetry, Hound and Horn, Pagany, Soil, Rogue. And I kept coming across this name, Mina Loy, alongside names like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Marianne Moore, Wallace Stevens. She was publishing in all the right places, in all the best places, in all the most experimental avant-garde contexts for what was just sort of the nascent years of what was called the free verse movement and modern poetry. But I hadn't heard of her, nor had my professors, nor had anyone. So who was this person? And then she was publishing also alongside, in some case, the name Mina Loy, another poet of that era. But I wondered, are these possibly the same person? Does Mina Loy really exist? Is it a pseudonym? Is she still alive? What's her story? What happened to her? And that became really the beginning of a lifelong quest to find answers to that question. Where is Mina Loy? Why did she disappear? What happened to the work that was so highly celebrated and critically acclaimed in her 20s and 30s in the 1910s and 20s? And yet today, she seems to have just vanished out of sight. So that really became the beginning of an attempt to recover the lost work, to see if she still wrote during the 50 or so years of absence when she stopped appearing in little magazines. She had 2 books published in her lifetime, one in 1923 by Robert McCallman's Contact Press in Paris, which was the first press also to publish the first books, not only by Mina Loy, but Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway, William Carlos Williams, and many other iconic figures. But once again, what Mina Loy is in this extraordinary company, but she has today, going back to the 1970s, no reputation. And what really led me to this desire to know more was that her work was extraordinary. It was unfamiliar, it was experimental, it was radical, and she chose subjects. She's writing at a time when female poets were called poetesses, and there was still sort of the veneer of Victorianism that was very traceable through the work of people like Edna St. Vincent Millay and Amy Lowell, and even Harriet Monroe from Chicago, who published a lot of those figures. Mina Loy's work was not like that. There was no trace of the poetess in her work. In fact, she was writing about subjects that were untouchable at that time by any poet, but particularly by a woman poet. Subjects like addiction and pederasty and homosexuality and pregnancy and parturition or childbirth. These were, and also some of her poetic verse was very satirical and quite savage toward some of the men who she had had relationships with, particularly Marinetti and Papini, the futurist. So anyway, she was breaking all the rules at a time when they weren't being broken by other women. And this, to answer your question, basically just made me want to know more. And the more I learned, the deeper it went and the deeper she got. And I never really found the depth of Mina Loy fully. She's still as compelling to me now as she was 50 years ago, and still learning, actually, I would say every week something new about Mina Loy, which this exhibition and the one in Brunswick, Maine at Bowdoin College have actually helped to produce new scholarship and new discourse on Mina Loy.
So actually, perfect segue to thinking about her, the exhibition as a visual artist. So when did you become aware that she had a visual oeuvre that had been overlooked?
So there was very little of a biographical nature about Mina Loy when I was in graduate school in the 1970s. And I didn't know if she was still alive, but I found out that she died in 1966 in Aspen, Colorado. And why Aspen? Because she had two daughters who lived there and who pretty much dragged her kicking and screaming from the Bowery to Aspen because they were embarrassed by the life that she was living in the Bowery and wanted to bring her back sort of into their world, into society. And I went to see Joella Bayer and Fabienne Benedict, the two daughters in Aspen. And my purpose was to ask questions about their mother and her life and poetry, but then it became evident quite quickly that their mother was also an artist, a visual artist, because there were her paintings around their homes. So that's the rather prosaic answer, is by going to see her daughter and seeing works on the walls.
Well, maybe we'll hear a little bit more about your tracking down, but I want to turn to Jennifer. You came to this exhibition project through Roger, but I think you came with some knowledge of Mina Loy, and I wanted to ask you what you knew about her when you started and how your knowledge of her has changed over time.
I actually knew nothing.
Okay, but you had a kind of impression.
So I'd been to Roger's house, and so I'd seen some of her work, but I really had no comprehension of the extent of her practice. Well, I think it had never been assembled. So really what you see it parsed out as a lifetime's work is very varied. And I had a few images in my mind, but I did know her milieu. And so Roger gave me some feelers in terms of the extent of her interfacing with the avant-garde of the period, which I'd done scholarship on and had a particular interest in the transatlantic movement of the modernists, and understood and had done a lot of work on artists who had been lost to history. So Mina was immediately of interest to me because there were many reasons that artists during that period were lost. It was a terrible time in the world over and over again. And so there was poverty, there was dispersal, illness and war and murder. And so to find where Mina's traces had gone was of great interest to me. And then going to visit Roger and seeing parts of all of these narratives in the work that he had in his home, and trying to then figure out how to piece that story together, which of course was a lot of fun because it was during COVID. So as a scholar, I've told people along the way this week, there are many leads yet to be pursued. And very excitingly today, as soon as he arrived, Roger let me know that 3 new works have come to light since the exhibition has been mounted. And this was our great hope, because I know of great pockets that I couldn't travel to pursue. And so this is our great hope that we can piece together even more of her artistic legacy.
Yeah, that was sort of my next question for both of you. You know, what were some of the great finds and what are some of the great losses or mysteries or things that don't exist that you know did exist?
You want to go first? Okay, let's see some of the losses. There are listed named, if you looked in the catalog, there are named full bodies of work from very early in her career. So in 1912, she had an exhibition in London. And interesting about Mina, and again, where history is not truthful to us, throughout her life, her work, every time she showed it, was very positively reviewed, seen, and appreciated, and sold. And so we know named groups of work that we don't know where they went. So there's that body of work. There is the work that she did with the Futurists. So she and Frances Stevenson were the only two women to show with the Futurists. They were both outsiders. Frances was an American, and through whom Mina met the Futurists. And so we know that they participated in the first international exhibition of the Italian Futurists, and we don't have any of those paintings. And they would be the one work. So Mina came away from the Futurists with her vernacular as a poet, but she then really reacted to them in many other ways. So she abandoned that particular form of expression in her visual art and actually then focused on being a designer, a successful lamp shop owner, and a number of other things before she came to a full, mature modernist body of work in the 30s when she worked with Julian Levy. So those would be a couple of spots for me.
Mina Loy had two exhibitions. Well, she had a number of exhibitions during her lifetime, but two major one-woman shows during her lifetime. One at the Bodley Gallery in 1958, and one at Julian Levy's gallery in New York in the 1930s. And we have a record of both of those shows, titles of the works in them, and we've been able to track down a number of works that were exhibited in those two contexts, but not all of them. So missing are works whose names we know, but whose images we don't know, except in some cases through the photographs of people like Berenice Abbott, who photographed rather extensively in a documentary context the show at the Bodley Gallery, which incidentally was the same gallery that showed one of Andy Warhol's very first shows in New York. It was quite a distinguished gallery in its time, as was the Julian Levy Gallery. A number of the works from those shows wound up in storage in the care of Joella Beyer, Mina Loy's eldest daughter, who had been married to Julian Levy for a number of years before she married Herbert Beyer. That's not a bad pedigree for, and Herbert Beyer's presence, I think, can be felt to some extent even in the exhibition design that Alejandro did here. Joella told me Joella was paying rent to a storage, I wouldn't even say company, but to a guy who had a storage shed in Connecticut where works from the Julian Levy exhibition had been stored for really decades. And she was tired of paying the rent. She wrote me at a certain point and said, Roger, if you're really that interested in my mother's work, you can go find some of Mina's trash at this place in Waterboro, Connecticut. So I drove there right away, got what was there. And it was like in corrugated cardboard boxes with mouse droppings and birds' nests. And some of the pieces were literally, even some of the pieces that are in the show now were split in half and just full, it was retrieving junk. And it was an act of salvage, I would say, salvage and salvation. And the point of that is that there could be other storage repositories of her work somewhere in the world, or there might have been at some point that we don't know, the existence of, and that might well have disappeared. But, there could still be that. One of the beautiful things, as was mentioned a few minutes ago about this exhibition, is that it's producing attention on the part of people who have had things, but didn't know who Mina Loy was or why they had them, because they inherited them from their parents or whatever. So three pieces, one in Florence, one in the Boston area, and one in New York, have surfaced since the exhibition at Bowdoin College opened. And Chicago may produce more, because there is although Mina Loy, I don't think she was ever in Chicago, there was a strong connection between Mina Loy and Margaret Anderson, who was one of the editors of the Little Review, which was originally based in Chicago.
And on one of the paintings downstairs, there's a label on the back that one of the paintings showed at the Richard Feigen Gallery in Chicago. So her work came here at least once.
Fantastic. Okay. Yeah.
So also too, there are major other bodies of work that we know existed that we do not have any trace of. So in the exhibition, you saw that Mina had a lampshade shot. She was a designer. We have no examples of that work. She did a full second exhibition of paintings for Julian Levy that he did not show, that we have photographs of them. She had them photographed in Paris. She had an exhibition that Peggy Guggenheim brought a full body. She had a portrait exhibition in Connecticut in 1925, very well reviewed. Peggy Guggenheim bought a whole other form of painting, which was the predecessor to the late paintings downstairs, of cut paper floral collages. They all sold. And there were 2 exhibitions in New York of them, and we cannot find any of them. A
Check your
portfolio.
living rooms.
Yeah,
This
check
has
your living
happened
room.
before at the Arts Club. We had a Gertrude Abercrombie show and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I think I might have one of those.
And the Chicago connection is that actually Marcel Duchamp and Mary Reynolds carried a portfolio of Mina's paintings to London during the Surrealist exhibition. We don't know where they were exhibited, but she knew Mary Reynolds quite well.
Mary Reynolds was a Chicago bookbinder, and she was partners with Duchamp, and they lived in Paris. And she, her book bindings are at the Art Institute.
I'm just going to throw this out there because we're in Chicago. There was a connection between the Pepke family and Mina Loy. Walter Pepke and Elizabeth Pepke were longtime Chicago residents and Aspen residents, and Walter Pepke was I believe, the founder and chairman of the Container Corporation, who hired Herbert Bayer as an exhibition designer.
From the Bauhaus.
And from the Bauhaus, yeah. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if the Pepkes had Mina Loys in their collection. Who knows what happened to the Pepke collection? I don't, but
Makes sense.
it's not unthinkable that it could be Mina Loy works in Chicago.
So this is the fascinating part of the sort of, like the detective part of art history that we could talk about for a long time. But I wanted to go back to sort of the substance of her inventiveness in both in terms of poetry and visual art. What connections across those media do you both see, and how do you see the art maybe as a departure?
In a very simple way, I would say her practice as a poet brought breath into her artistic compositions. And I think she's, as you see from very early on, she's a very gifted draftsperson. And she moves away from that in her consideration of becoming a modernist, and is able to return to that capacity and her deep commitment to representing humanity through the breath, I think. I think those Levy paintings show that she felt very confident of the importance of breath in the delivery of images. And so I think that comes from the poetry.
I agree with that. I would also say that Mina Loy brought into the language of modernism something that had been pretty well expunged from it, which was wonderment and awe and enchantment. She resisted the sort of homogeneity of the rational modernity that was insisting on scientific logic and thought in favor of a kind of irrational modernity that also reflected her interest in things like theosophy and alchemy and numerology. She was a Christian Scientist. She practiced phrenology. And this may be one of the reasons actually why she was somewhat neglected, because this was not really the way that proper modernists were supposed to behave. So she was bringing this sort of underside of an irrationality of modernity that is still, in terms of scholarly work, not as fully acknowledged, I think, as it should be, given its importance. So this brings us, links between people like Mina Loy and Aleister Crowley and Madame Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, all people that she was very interested in and read, but which don't really belong to standard canonical art historical discourse.
It's very embarrassing to be a spiritualist in modernism, which is supposed to be rational, which is sort of reflected in the design downstairs, where there's this push and pull between a kind of straight line and a bodily curvature. So we thought about that too. So this exhibition in many ways is kind of rehabilitative of a lost reputation of an important artist of the avant-garde. And so we think of her as sort of forgotten, lost, all these stories of the neglect of her work and the fact that she didn't quite fit in. But Jennifer, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about her critical reception, because it wasn't lacking at all moments.
No, so that's an interesting, and you'd mentioned, asked me to think about this. And so I've went through her career and really, so Mina, her first acclaim came when she was just out of the academy in Paris. And she was, as a 22-year-old, nominated to be a member of the Société in Paris, which was an extraordinary recognition. And one of the recognitions in her life she was the proudest of throughout her life. And so there she was, a very young woman, young mother, and she was asked to contribute her work every year. She was eventually asked to be a member of their drawing committee. And when she showed her work at that time in Paris, 1905, 1906, the work was considered, she wasn't, again, all throughout her life, here she was, a nice lady, who was it that said, wore nice lady shows and designed lampshades. She was already provocative. So one of the, I think, misidentifications of her when I came to the work was that she was a retiring kind of a victim of her legacy and her life. And she never was. She suffered from depression, which kept her at moments subdued in her conduct socially, but she was an evanescent presence wherever she went. And so in Paris, she was received initially and grouped with people like Beardsley and Rops, who were considered scandalous. Her very first drawings, when you look at the ones down in at the gallery, they were considered too provocative of the representation of the real world. And then she goes to and is involved with this. Thank you. She's involved with the futurists, and then her work is again shown in London, and it's recognized for its fine form. Then she comes to New York and is showing her work, is very involved with the Arensberg Circle, and immediately embraced both in terms of her and everything. So the Guggenheim works, again, remarkable draftsmanship. The Levy show was considered mysterious to the critics. And they again called out, as Janine identified, they were a little bit nervous about Mina's, outer realms of her emotional and spiritual expression in her art. But then perpetually in the Bodley show, always recognition. And very importantly, when you're looking back through time as a scholar trying to understand the context, the thing that's extraordinary about Mina's life is how embraced and admired she was by her equals, her superlative equals, and was embraced not only as a poet and writer and a critic for her very sharp intellect in every community, whether it was in Paris in the 20s. She was dear friends. Gertrude Stein said when she met Mina, and again, Mina was a very young woman, she said, Mina always understood the commas. Mina always understood. And so her remarkable clarity in terms of her embrace of both visual and oral creativity were recognized throughout her life. Really.
Did you want to add anything, Roger, about that?
Just that I also want to add that she was challenged to make a living throughout her life. She was a single mom. She had two daughters who survived. She had two children who died, which is part of her depression, I think, and part of the tragedy of her life that she never really recovered from, along with a missing husband, Arthur Craven, the poet boxer who disappeared at sea mysteriously after a 6-month relationship that left her pregnant and devastated by his loss. But during all this time, she was putting stuff out there. She was putting out dress designs for fashion magazines, inventions for various kinds of scientific apparatus that mostly were inventions in service of women's work and domestic household work, some examples of which are downstairs. But the pressure to take care of her daughters was very real, and she was navigating this kind of crazy life where she'd be on the one hand having dinner with Brancusi and Joyce one night, and then going to help her daughters with homework the next day. Can I just read an excerpt of a letter that she wrote to her younger daughter, Fabienne?
Please.
Because I think it'll give a sense of this. Feel free to. Okay,
Well, yeah, it's perfect timing. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is Mina Loy to her daughter, Fabienne, when her daughter was a teenager and Mina Loy's living in Florence, she addresses her, "My darling Stinky Binky." I want to give you a little advice. I don't know if you will like it, but you have a terrible problem with perspiration. I think you should go to see a doctor just to find out the cause, which I believe is some element of that you're lacking in nutrition. I think you're also a bit anemic. Sorry, Marinetti's at the door. I have to go. That's
That is classic. That's amazing. Having had my own daughter here earlier this evening, I very much relate. Funny. Well, my next question was going to be about her life. And so, you know, in our history, and especially as I would call myself a feminist art historian, I'll just say that, you know, we struggle with biography, right? We struggle with how to deal with the lives of female identifying artists because we don't want to overly, you know, turn them into their life. But in Mina's case, it does seem particularly striking the way she performed her life as both a daughter, a mother, a lover, you know, all these different roles. And I wanted to bring that to ask you guys to first comment on do we lean into the biography? Do we push away from it? How have you thought about that as both scholars of her work?
Well, I think for me, starting at my work on the exhibition, one of the things that I was very aware of is the biography had dominated any approach to Mina's art and to her recognition for herself, that was a problem. She was an extremely beautiful woman. And actually just in the last month, I watched a documentary about Hedy Lamarr, who had like the same problem, where she really wanted to be recognized for her intelligence, and it really no one could get to it because they were so gobstopped by how exquisite. And for Mina, it was the same thing. And unfortunately, in terms of any approaches to her in history, that's sort of where the door stops every single time, was just her extraordinary biography. And as you will read in the exhibition and in the catalog, she had a remarkable life, a remarkable existence. And so to get to the work, to get to understanding and really focusing on what she was striving for creatively and what was, you know, her aspiration for her life, which transcended all of these things. So as Janine, I think, said, and Roger also, while she kept her life on the tracks, and she had, you know, part of having children was part of this, a manifesto for her as a woman to be, to carry out all aspects of what she could be as a person, but she wanted to do it differently. She wanted that to be a kind of articulation of her autonomy away from what had been the consigned destiny she was told about as a Victorian young woman, and what she moved away from rapidly and like practically screaming from in teenage years. And so that was a challenge, is to get away from all of that wonderful biography. I hope I've folded it in, but the idea was to, how do we foreground all of the work, and how do we draw connections between her known creativity as a poet and this art that has not been seen. And so, and interestingly, while she chose always to be representing often people or faces or hands, the work itself is not autobiographical so much, even as in the early work, she's representing women all the time. It's a way for her to understand their role in society. It's her way for her to record the unrecognized. She's committed to that throughout her life, all the way to the end when she's, you know, on the Bowery. But it was less about her visual experience and more about her experience deeply in terms of being a human being. And that, I think, is really what's very compelling about the work.
She's been legitimately called a symbolist, a Dadaist, a futurist, a surrealist, a conceptualist, a painter, poet, playwright, inventor, designer, model. She was actor. She was too much. She was too many things. And she was, I mean, the word beautiful is overused, I think, but I would say she was pulchritudinous, which means heartbreakingly, achingly beautiful, to the point that it really got in the way of her work, because she was also cerebral. She was highly critically intellectual and bitingly satirical in her writing. But at the same time, she was this this force of seduction and of charisma, and that's a lot to take in. And I think it's part of the reason that art history has not taken her in, because choose one thing, call yourself a poet, call yourself a painter. But she was not only both; she was damn good as a poet and a painter. And there aren't very many examples in all of art history or all of literary history, like that. I mean, you can point to someone, like Kenneth Patchen and say he was also a painter. Yeah, but he was a he will always be much more remembered as a poet than a painter. And likewise, Elizabeth Bishop will always be remembered more as a poet than a painter. But that's with Mina Loy, that's not the case. She, particularly given now, will be remembered as both, and is highly accomplished in both. So I think that's part of the issue with her assimilation. I mean, Samuel Beckett said the danger is the neatness of identification and the neatness of classification. And that is a danger, because there is a tendency to classify and to place. And Mina Loy is not placeable in that sense, like most artists are.
And building on that, Roger and I have had extensive conversations where we agree that it had to come to today for this moment to happen, to approach her, because art history has changed in the last few years, and the world has become much more interested in the porous interconnection between things. And so certainly in art history, it's enabled us to bring all of this together and for people to be keenly interested in seeing it. So it's timely. We still think she's ahead of us, though. So we still have another 10 to 20 years to really catch up with Mina.
What do you think of her feminist manifesto? And do you want to just give us a little context for when it was written?
Yeah, I can start. Well, the Feminist Manifesto was never published during her lifetime. It was actually sent as a kind of experimental trial piece, a polemic to her friend Mabel Dodge, later Mabel Dodge Lewin, in a letter saying, what do you think of this? Do you think it's too radical? Do you think this could be published? And it never was published until the 1982 edition of the Lost Leonard Baedeker. And, in that manifesto, which I think is it reproduced downstairs, but it's in the catalog anyway. Yeah.
It's in the vitrine, but not the full thing.
Okay. She seriously advocated for the surgical destruction of virginity at puberty for the entire female population, to get rid of what she called the man-made boogie of virtue. She felt that feminine virtue was a weight and a burden on womankind that should be removed. And this was one of her radical propositions for the removal of the idea of virtue. Just let's get rid of the notion of virginity by just destroying it, at a certain point. So this does not become an issue around marriage or relationships or anything else. She was, even now people say, was she serious? And yeah, she was serious. I'll stop there.
Oh, good. I'm glad you took care of that part. So, and also folded into her feminist manifesto. So it's full of contradictions. The start of the manifesto is really extraordinarily powerful even to this day, because she understood and I'm not going to quote it. I wish I had it in front of me. Oh, is it? Oh,
Not right this minute.
okay.
It's coming around. You can see it.
But really, so she thinks that she states very clear that women have three possibilities in their life. They can choose prostitution. They can choose to to live off of, or be a parasite off of. And in her case, her experience and exposure, that was to the wealthy class around her, or to men, to expect them to care for her and provide. Or in her case, and it's my thought, Roger might have a different, that she chose negation, that she chose the freedom to operate outside all of those expected roles. And so the suffering that she had in her life, because she had to make her own agency in the world, she, stepped away from the comforts of the structure of Victorian society. She didn't accept that she had to play into the structure that marriage would have provided her. And she chose to endeavor forth and not be recognized, as history did. In fact, she didn't accommodate. She didn't accommodate as a woman. And as Roger said, she loved to be at, everyone in Paris loved to be at a dinner party with Mina, but you also understood that not only was she going to tell you the most brilliant thing, but she would probably cut you to your knees. And she did it consistently in both the visual art community and in the poetry community. And so she chose that autonomy of the significance of her belief in her own veracity. And yet in the same manifesto, she said, and women like myself of my intelligence should have a child with every man they think is smart, because that would be great for the world. And she did do this. I mean, in fact, accepted with Marinetti. She was at a dinner party, and I forget the woman whose biography it's quoted. And she said, Mina Loy came in the door looking like a futurist confection and stated loudly in the room, I really should, the World War was on. And she said, I should just have a child because there's nothing more interesting for women to do during wartime. And she did decide not to have his child and became a nurse in a field hospital. But you know, she thought that might be a viable occupation for a few months. So
There's a fragment of the Feminist Manifesto now behind us or in front of you.
I just find it a crazy text, and there's, I mean, I'll say for my own self, there are things in it that, well, you've raised some of them, you know, that are disturbing, you know, so like we're kind of in awe of her, but at the same time, there are points at which we find, you know, there are anachronistic things or things that we can't get on with.
Yeah, she was a disruptor, that's for sure, and that's partly why she's so contemporary now. I think that she is.
I think so.
She is disturbing the status quo even now.
Yeah, she remains that way. I want to look at her later work. I don't know, Jenna, if you could put up the Christ on a Clothesline maybe, and we'll talk about, there's other great ones downstairs. So to skip forward a little bit, towards the end of her life, the exhibition shows how she had become quite destitute. She had moved to New York. She was living on the Bowery in what we used to call a flop house. I don't know what the updated term of a flop house is. And both of her daughters had moved away to Aspen. And she was, in relation to the street population on the Bowery, she was friends with them, I guess is the best way to put it. And then she was kind of secretly making constructions. She was not recognized in her time for being part of what became like the art of, famously at the Museum of Modern Art, the art of assemblage, or, you know, the things that led into kind of people like Rauschenberg, but she was almost their contemporaries, right? So
they very well could have seen her work. So there, you know, the show at the Bodley Gallery was haunted by people of significance in our community, but never was she embraced by that.
So I guess I maybe said more than I'm asking, but maybe to pause on this work and talk about her late life. You know, what is remarkable about it to you, and maybe a little bit about how this is the work that you took out of the shed to some, not this piece, I don't think, but yeah.
Not this one.
Yeah. But to pause on sort of to look more closely at some of this later work and her inventiveness. Do you just want to say a little bit of how it's made? To go ahead, Roger, if you were going to say something else.
Well, you know, I mean, the crucifix is an image throughout art history, but who puts Christ on a clothesline? And why would she do that? And what does that even mean? And that's a question that really hasn't been asked or answered yet by art historians. You can say in one sense, this painting, this construction rather, this collage reaches back to Raphael and to the Renaissance. It also reaches forward to someone like Andrea Serrano, just Christ. I mean, it's occupying a very interesting space, but in a very different way than any other painter has portrayed Christ. And it also brings in the kind of banality of her world, living in the Bowery at the time. It's made from the detritus, found things in the streets. The head of Christ is a rag mop, hair. He's dressed in rags. Mina Loy is Jewish. She's among the other things I didn't mention. She's Jewish, Hungarian, English, American, British. So so that's so this piece is bringing her life in the Bowery home, and it's also describing her home as a place where both theology and existentialism and homelessness and poverty and And the life of the street was very much what her imagination, what animated her imagination. Very, very early for a poet or painter to be celebrating the dignity of what we call now the unhoused or homeless people, but she was doing that in the 1940s and 50s. And she was making pieces like this before Rauschenberg, significantly before Rauschenberg. This is all quite surprising, and I think in its time was not very appreciated. The show that she had at the Bobbies, the major champions of that show were Duchamp, Joseph Cornell, and Juna Barnes. Those were about the only three people that she had allowed to visit her toward the end of her life when she was quite reclusive. And this piece actually stayed in New York City. It was bought by a couple art collectors in the Bowery. It stayed in their apartment for the next 50 years. I'd seen it a couple of times. I'd gone there, but when they died a couple of years ago, this came up at auction. And so this was actually what I consider to be really one of her masterworks, along with Communal Cot and a couple of other pieces, I would say. But
Yeah.
it's great that you have it here.
I'm glad you mentioned communal cot because it also has that kind of like humanity in it. It's downstairs if you didn't look at it, of the individuation of the people that most people would overlook. It's quite poignant. I'm getting the sign from Jenna, but let me just ask you one more question and then I'll open it up to the floor. So where do we find an audience for Mina Loy today? I'm actually interested in all of you too. Like, are you where you know I know people come to her from different angles, and you've looked, I know, at certain things. So yeah, so maybe just talk about that.
You mean an audience?
Who's interested in her besides all of us?
I think everyone should be interested. There's so many different aspects of Mina to be interested in. So, and I think that's part of the fun. I mean, if we're talking about her in terms of being an artist, I think one of the remarkable things about the arc of her career, again, which hasn't quite fit into our history, is the very long view she had as a creator. So I particularly am fascinated with her initial, skill as a draftsman, but she transcends that, and it's not satisfying enough to her. She invents these cut paper works, which were critically received well in New York, and said they weren't quite paintings, but they were paintings. And then she, is able to respond by creating a whole new fresco kind of painting as a modernist for the Levy exhibition. And then at the end of her life, I think she was really, the two happy places in Mina's life were in Paris, when she had total agency financially and creatively, and then also on the Bowery. So I feel that there was this great blossoming for her there. She was still connected to the avant-garde. She was free of the kind of critical censorship of her children and of social expectation at that point on the Bowery. She saw her life and the suffering in her life as coextensive with the other, remember that the level of poverty and struggle after the war was significant everywhere. And so in New York, she was in a milieu of people she saw that were similar to herself. She felt a fraternity. The bums called her the Duchess, but she was free to create again. And here she creates this remarkable form of painting that goes all the way back to the very first constructions that she made in Paris in 1920 or so. So for me, I think what's exciting is and for people who are interested in art, is that continual reinvention of creativity and her commitment to that, and how it just kept growing. And, up until the end of her life. And that even, when she didn't have money, she invented, or that when she wanted to make fashions, because that was another opportunity, they were all wonderful outlets for the way that she engaged the world. And so I think that's for audiences yet to still understand.
There's something very exciting happening now between musicians and Mina Loy. If I told you that Billy Corgan of Smashing Pumpkins and Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth both have devoted songs to Mina Loy, called Mina Loy, in the past 5 years, you'd think I was kidding, but that's a fact. There's also a rapper in Florida named Buster Wolf who came to Bowdoin to do a performance when the exhibition was there, who gave the just phenomenally wonderful performance based on Mina Loy's language that he assimilates and incorporates and appropriates into his own rap repertoire. I think this is in part because they identify Mina Loy as they identify themselves, as an outcast, as someone who doesn't fit, and as someone who's reaching for some kind of eternity, but not of a conventional or religious nature. So I would say in music and dance communities, particularly now, there's something very exciting happening with Mina Loy.
Amazing. Okay, so I just want to bring your attention to the fact that we have, there's a beautiful book published by Bowdoin in the Princeton University Press, which is available here tonight with essays by both Jennifer and Roger in it. So if you want to learn more, you have that opportunity. And now I'll open up the floor for your questions, and remember to hold your hand up for a microphone, and otherwise we will repeat your question here. Any thoughts or questions? Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, my question is about the extensiveness of Mina Loy's body of work. Is there a sense as to like how many pieces she's produced and how many poems have been written by her or maybe recognized?
Do you want to ask about the poetry, and I'll answer about the art?
Sure. In terms of her poetry, I would say the work that's most worthy of publication has been published. There's no writer who would want everything they've written to be published. So there are many things that exist in a draft state at the Beinecke Library as part of their holdings that in some cases probably were not meant to be published. They remain drafts, they remain unfinished. So there's a whole nature of archival material that I think will probably remain a source for scholarship, but not necessarily a destination for readers to find what they will find in her existing published work. But yeah, I mean, I would say that for the most part, her poems have been published. There's a 2 or 3 novels that remain unpublished, prose works. There's also one of her medias, one of her media. One novel has been published called Insel. 2 novels remain unpublished. I think one of them will be published in the next couple of years.
Has Crystal Pantomime been published?
Yes, that has been published. Yeah.
So just to give us another plug, in May, Every House Has a Door will be interpreting one of her texts. I thought it might be unpublished, called Crystal Pantomime. So we will have a performance here at the Arts Club and the week later at Hull House Museum. So stay tuned for that.
Just one other comment I'll make on that was that she also published pseudonymously. She varied her name a lot. So sometimes she was Mina Loy, sometimes she was Inma Oli, sometimes she was Nina Yole. She was an anagrammatist, and she liked to play with the letters of her name as well as the names of other people. Marinetti was and Papini were featured as Papini, and I forget exactly what Marinetti was, but anyway, she was twisting names, and so it's possible there's pseudonymous work in little magazines that we don't identify as hers. She also published in a lot of out of the way women's magazines. There's a magazine called Charm, which was published in New Jersey by Bamberger's Department Store, which was mostly a women magazine devoted to women's fashion. Gina Barnes published there a column under the name Lady Lydia Steptoe. Mina Loy might have been a contributor to Charm magazine. We know that she published at least one essay there on modern poetry. So it's possible there's, to answer your question another way, that there are pieces by Mina Loy that we don't recognize as hers because she didn't claim them under her real name and because they didn't appear in literary magazines.
If you're genuinely interested, one of the delightful things in the universe is that Beinecke Library, who has her archives, has digitized all of it. So you can go online and read as many drafts of Mina Loy as you would like. So that's really terrific. Anyone can. So, and then in terms of the art, I think my earlier answer to the question of how her work has been dispersed and how there is the opportunity to pursue other leads. So I do think scholars, it was our hope in terms of the exhibition that it would air Mina, introducing her into the stream of art history. And we hope many young scholars will carry on the work, but there is definitely work to be found as we are finding out. So.
I've got a question from the Zoom. If the microphone is traveling, I can fill.
I have a quick question.
Okay,
I
fine,
just
Sylvia.
saw the photograph with Peggy Guggenheim, and I No, she had a gallery in New York called Art of the Century, and she had a show in 42, I believe, showing women's artists. Did that relationship go beyond her visiting her lamp shop or not?
They had, so no, Mina did not show there. And interesting, even though Mina interfaced with the Société Anonyme, she didn't show with them either. But Peggy and her relationship continued. It had tumultuous turns. And so they closed that chapter unhappily. That was a relationship there that didn't end well. But later on in her life, Peggy did come to her exhibition in New York and did purchase a painting of Mina's. And so she clearly continued to admire her. She always, in fact, later in life, Peggy retracted some of the terrible things she had done to Mina in terms of the management of her art. And she did support her creativity consistently, but Mina withdrew. So I think I didn't really very well explain, but while evanescent on turns as someone with depression, she would retract. And so as she moved on later in her life, only her most intimate friends could reach into that place with her, people like Joseph Cornell and others. And so she would see friends in New York, from Joseph Stella to others, but she did not reach out to someone as vivacious and socially as Peggy was. So, and Peggy was a tough nugget. So for everybody.
We have the Zoom question, Jenna.
Ah, yes. This is from Crystal, who comments that Mina seems like in some ways she's a little bit comparable to Da Vinci in that she had multiple creative outlets. And she also asks if the exhibition might travel to the West Coast or to other locations in the US.
And Goodyear? Any traveling?
Maybe I'll just start by saying, Janine,
This is
Maybe-
Ann Goodyear from Bowdoin College.
I'd like to just start by saying thank you, Janine, to you and to your amazing team. I think the show looks spectacular here. And I love the creative interpretation that you have brought. And I know that that is with, in partnership with Jennifer Gross, who is the curator of the exhibition. Roger, we're also grateful to you for being so generous with your knowledge and also your creative thinking about Mina Loy. So we're so happy the show is here in Chicago. I think it belongs here. We were talking earlier this evening, and we've had conversations previously about the fact that Constantin Brancusi's Golden Bird, which inspired Lloyd to create a poem, actually was originally here at the Arts Club of Chicago. So maybe that's one of the reasons that she feels so much at home in this space. We are exploring the possibility of some other venues, so we'll wait and see what happens, including also exploring the possibility of whether there's some opportunity to bring Mina Loy back to Europe. But we'll see what transpires. But speaking of birds, we are so glad for this bird in the hand and cannot say enough about what a spectacular installation you all have created here. So thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Well, on that lovely note, I think I will thank you all for coming. Please take some more time to visit the exhibition and don't forget to pick up the catalog on your way out. Thank you.